All right, greetings everyone. I actually just recorded this lecture, about a third of it at least, and then something went wrong and I got interrupted, and then I thought I had paused the recording, but I hadn't paused the recording, and so there's a big blank space. So bottom line is this is my second go at this. Hopefully that's good. Maybe I have a little rehearsal done, okay? So let me begin by sharing my screen. Whoops. Share my screen. And where's the screen I want? Here we go. Okay, and so this is going to be a lecture on scientism. The lecture is drawn from the first chapter, I think it's the first chapter of a book called Scholastic Metaphysics. Sounds fun, huh? But it's written by a man named Edward Feser. Feser. It's pronounced Phaser, but it's spelled F-E-S-R. So I keep calling him Feser, but it's not. It's Phaser, like Star Trek Phaser. Anyway, he is a neo-scholastic or a neo-Thomist. And what that means is that he is a philosopher who subscribes to the philosophical writings and theories and the worldview of Thomas Aquinas, and more broadly, scholastic philosophers. Now, Thomas Aquinas, we haven't talked about that too much in this class, but Aquinas is writing at the end of the High Middle Ages. He has developed, with his work, he develops a really monumental worldview that incorporates the classical worldview of Plato and of Aristotle. And he ends up kind of effecting a synthesis between those two thinkers. Now, if you recall, those two ancient Greek philosophers actually disagreed on a number of important issues. So synthesizing those two was rather challenging. And yet he does. And he not only synthesizes them, but he develops his own views. And this is a very broad and all-encompassing worldview referred to as scholasticism. It incorporates, among many other things, it's a heavily Aristotelian. It's Platonic, but it's also heavily Aristotelian. And it incorporates Aristotle's notion of the four causes: formal cause, final cause, efficient cause, and material cause, right? And but you'll recall that modern science, modern physics, is almost defined by rejection of that classical worldview and that classical view of causality, where you explain things in terms of four different causes. Also, modern science, and particularly modern physics, they're deeply suspicious of metaphysics at all, whether any such thing is possible. And many of them reject essentialism. So they're not only rejecting final causality, teleology, but they also often are rejecting formal causality or essentialism. And they try to explain the world merely by talking about matter and motion and mathematical laws which govern the motion of this matter in space. Right? This is what Galileo uses to explain what he wants to explain. This is what Newton uses to explain what he wants to explain. As certainly early physics was very much trying to do that, explain as much as they could about the world in terms of the physical qualities of the world, etc. So Feser is going to be challenging the view which holds that science, modern science, and physics not only can explain what it attempts to explain, but really there is no aspects of reality that are beyond the ability of physics to investigate and to understand and to explain. Right? That basically physics, and maybe more broadly the natural sciences in general, are the only area that gives us objective knowledge about reality. And that if you're not doing science, then we're deeply suspicious about whether you're doing anything rational or you're doing any kind of legitimate inquiry. So this is, scientism then would be a view which suggests that the domain of rational inquiry is the domain of the empirical sciences. And there is no extra scientific inquiry or rational inquiry. Again, there doesn't seem to be much of a room for metaphysics or philosophy in general, for that matter, or my view of traditional philosophy. So you don't have to be a neo-Thomist or a neo-scholastic like Edward Feser, to see the power of the arguments he brings. So the arguments he brings against scientism, again, he thinks scientism is wrong. The arguments he brings against scientism is not rooted in the truth of scholasticism. They're just talking about the kind of incoherence of scientism as a view, right? And so that's what he's going to attack. So that's what we're looking at. Basically, what is scientism and why is it an unsatisfactory view? This is, there we go. So when we looked at the development of modern science, we saw that Aristotelian style metaphysics is dismissed out of hand in the name of a scientistic or naturalist position. Edward Feser identifies this scientism position as the following. Scientism is the view that science alone plausibly gives us objective knowledge, and that any metaphysics worthy of consideration can only be that which is implicit in science. So if implied in science is the existence of a mind-independent world, well, then maybe that's a metaphysical claim we'll accept, right? Or if implied in the business of science is the metaphysical view that there are causes, well, then we'll accept that metaphysical view. But we're only going to look at the metaphysics which is implied by the execution of science. Feser maintains that there are, in fact, no good arguments recommending scientism. And in fact, there are decisive arguments against scientism. Right? So he's going to, preview of coming attractions, he's going to be arguing that scientism is an unwarranted view and presents us with a very narrow concept of what the domain of rational inquiry is. So he's going to look at we're going to look at four general problems with scientism, right? The first one is he claims that scientism is self-defeating, and it can avoid being self-defeating only by repackaging itself as kind of a trivial and uninteresting theory. So it seems that it waffles between either being incoherent or trivial, but it can't be interestingly coherent. That's his claim. Right? And we'll see about that in a moment. Then his second claim is that the scientific method cannot even in principle provide us with a complete description of reality, that reality is simply too rich, too varied to be captured by the empirical sciences alone. He's not saying that the empirical sciences can't capture some aspect of objective reality. He certainly thinks it does. He just doesn't think it can capture all aspects of reality, and therefore an inquiry into the nature of reality has to be broader than science if it's going to capture these other elements of reality. In a similar way, he's going to argue that science cannot even in principle give us the fundamental explanations of reality. In large part, he's going to argue that because science requires a presumption of natural laws, but science is incapable of telling us what natural laws are. So they reference natural laws, but they don't tell us what the natural laws are. So if they don't explain what natural laws are, but the natural laws are supposed to explain the world, well, then they aren't giving us an exhaustive explanation of the world. They're giving us kind of a truncated explanation of the world, where natural laws are kind of a promissory note for further explanations down the line. And then finally, what is probably the main argument in favor of scientism, the argument for the predictive and technological successes of modern physics and the other sciences, has no force, claims Feser. In other words, he says, look, one of the reasons people most often give in favor of scientism is because of how powerful scientific theories are. They're so far-reaching, they're so explanatory, they've given us marvelous technologies. We have microwave ovens. We've been to the moon and back, allegedly. No, I think we've been to the moon and back. So science can give us all these wonderful new technologies and new abilities and solve all kinds of problems. Therefore, scientism is probably true. Well, he wants to not deny that science can provide us with all these useful, powerful theories. But what he's saying is that in and of itself is not reason to think that scientism is true. Why? Well, stay tuned. So let's begin with the the first objection. And the first objection presents scientism with a dilemma, right? Either you're self-defeating or you're trivial. Those are the two horns of the dilemma. And no matter which way you go, it doesn't look good for scientism, right? So the first horn of the dilemma can be understood by looking at this quote from a scientist named Rosenberg, who was defending scientism, was saying that the methods of science are the only reliable ways to secure knowledge of anything. Now, if what Rosenberg is saying is true, if the methods of science are the only way to secure reliable knowledge of anything, well, then the domain of inquiry, the domain of knowledge, is the domain of science, right? Because you can only use science to gain objective knowledge. And if you can't use science to gain that knowledge, then it doesn't exist. You can't get it at all, right? This seems to be what scientism is claiming. This is what Rosenberg is claiming in this quote. But notice, it should become almost immediately clear to anyone who gives it half a moment's reflection that what Rosenberg is saying is not a scientific claim. It's not a scientific claim. And you can't use the methods of science to prove that that sentence is true. So it's immediately self-defeating. You can't say that the only way to prove anything true or false is to use science, or the only meaningful claims about the world are scientific claims, when that isn't a claim that can be proven by science. It's not, in fact, a scientific claim at all. So that claim itself is not a scientific claim. It is nothing that the scientific method can establish. So it's already sawed off the branch it was sitting on. Right? We cannot establish scientifically that science is a rational form of inquiry, let alone the only rational form of inquiry. So science doesn't ratify itself in that way. Scientific inquiry rests on a number of philosophical assumptions. Number one, that there is an objective world external to the minds of the scientists. Number two, that the world is governed by regularities of the sort that might be captured by scientific laws. Things don't just happen by happenstance, they happen in predictable patterned ways. That seems to be a presumption, a philosophical presumption that science relies on. And third, and science makes others, but we're only looking at these three right now, that the human intellect and perceptual apparatuses can uncover accurately and accurately describe these regularities, so that the human mind and the human perceptual apparatus and human intellect is appropriately suited to discover objective facts about the scientific world. Now, those are presumptions made by science, and maybe because you have to believe them before you can start doing science. Now, maybe after you start doing science, you go, hey, I think those presumptions are true, right? But you needed those presumptions to get the whole scientific project started in the first place. So that's why they remain presumptions. Scientific methods presuppose these things. It therefore cannot attempt to justify them without arguing in a circle. Right? You go, well, we did science and it shows that the presumptions of science are good. Yeah, but how do I know your science is any good? What if the presumptions are bad? Then your science is bad, right? Well, but the science says it's okay. Yeah, but that doesn't prove it, right? Again, you're begging the question. You're arguing in a circle. To break out of the circle requires an extra scientific vantage point to validate science. Quote, but then the very existence of that extra scientific vantage point would falsify the claim that science alone gives us rational means of investigating objective reality. So if you think back to our Welcome to the Wonderful World of Philosophy lecture, I kind of anticipated this, right? When we talked about how science can't validate itself because it would be like writing your own letter of recommendation. Well, Fazer is making the same point here, right? Philosophy has traditionally been invoked to justify these scientific presumptions about the existence of an external world, of the reliability of the intellect, the reliability of law-like patterns that exhibit themselves in the universe, etc. But more than that, philosophy also examines the question of how to interpret what science has to tell us about the world. So philosophy seems to be involved by, number one, setting up the necessary presumptions in order to get the scientific business started. But then philosophy also acts as a means of interpreting the deliverances of science. For instance, is the world fundamentally comprised of substances or events? How are we best to interpret the deliverances of physics and quantum physics and subatomic physics, etc.? Some have suggested we should not interpret it as the existence of substances, but as the existence of events. Well, are they events? Are they substances? That seems to be a philosophical question. And so we're trying to figure out how to interpret the experimental events that science provides. What is it to be a cause? Again, that's a philosophical question. What is the nature of universals, referring to scientific laws, concepts like quark, electron, atomics, and so on? Okay, sorry about that. I got interrupted, but I'm back. All right, so notice we have to determine whether or not our talk about universals, where we're talking about classes of things, classes of quarks or electrons or atoms, gold or mercury or whatnot, whether or not these are referencing essences, mind-independent realities that are in fact unchanging, or nominalism. In other words, are we simply using language to divide up our world, and we happen to divide it up one way, but it could be divided up any number of other ways, right? Well, that's a philosophical question. It's not a scientific question, but it's a philosophical question relevant to the interpretation of science. So again, this is what Fazer has in mind, in that philosophy not only gives us the operating presumptions of science, but offers us ways of interpreting the deliverances of science. Likewise, do theoretical entities exist over and above the particular things that instantiate them? Also, do scientific theories really give us a description of objective reality in the first place, or are they just useful tools for predicting the course of experience? This is a debate, a philosophical debate between instrumentalists and realists. And the instrumentalists are saying, look, what science does is it gives us useful mathematical models for predicting experience and manipulating experience, but it's not giving us an actual description of a mind-independent world. Whereas the realists are saying, no, it is giving us a description of the mind-independent world. Now, the debate between the instrumentalists and the realists, it's not a debate about what science is doing or how science is conducted or what the results of scientific investigation are. It's a question of what do the results of scientific investigation mean? What do they indicate? How are they best understood or interpreted? And that's not a scientific question. It's a philosophical question, right? Philosophy of science, actually. Oops. So while scientific findings can shed light on such metaphysical and epistemological questions, they can never fully answer them. Yet, quoting from Fazer, yet if science depends on philosophy both to justify its presumptions and to interpret its results, the falsity of scientism is doubly assured. Fazer quotes John Keith, who says, hence philosophy and not science is the stronger candidate for being the very paradigm of rationality. The second horn of the dilemma, and I might say, okay, fine. There is a certain amount of philosophy that needs to be done by science, but that really is science. It's really part of science. These debates between realism and instrumentalism, these debates between essentialists and nominalists, these debates who are talking about a mind-independent world, et cetera, those are really scientific debates. They're not just philosophical debates. What you're calling philosophy is really just a high level of science. Advocates of scientism might now insist then that if philosophy really does have this status, justifying the presumptions, interpreting the results, etc., then these inquiries and corresponding claims must really be part of science. All rational inquiry is scientific inquiry, and there is no outside of science. But then, if you take that route, the previously bold claim of scientists becomes completely trivial. By arbitrarily redefining science so that it includes any bit of rational argumentation that could be put forward as evidence against the view, there is no rational inquiry outside of science, the advocate defends scientism by trivializing it. So notice, if I said there is no rational inquiry outside of rational inquiry, that's a trivial claim. So if I identify science as being all rational inquiry, then to say there's no rational inquiry outside of science, all I'm really saying is there is no science outside of science, or there is no rational inquiry outside of rational inquiry. Yeah, okay, that's true, but it's trivial, right? So if you identify what notice the interesting thing about scientism is it was saying, look, metaphysics isn't science, and therefore it's not a form of rational inquiry. But if you want to say, oh no, metaphysics is a form of rational inquiry, but that makes it science, well, then you've just trivialized the scientism. This move makes scientism consistent with the views that are supposed to be incompatible with it. Recall, scientism stood as a supposed critique on metaphysics and the rationality of metaphysics. Willard Van Orman Quine, we really didn't talk about Quine in this class, might be an advocate of such a view, or sort of naturalized epistemology. Don't worry about that. For examples of arguments, you might give an unmoved mover argument or an uncaused cause argument. What Fazer is trading on here are metaphysical arguments that were offered initially by Aristotle, were taken over by Aquinas. And what Aristotle and Aquinas were saying is, look, once we understand the notion of motion, and the nature of motion, I should say, then we would know that there has to be an unmoved mover. Or once we understand the notion of causality, then we know there has to be an uncaused cause. So both Aristotle and Aquinas are beginning with empirical observation, but saying the truth of these empirical observations lead us by rational argument and abstraction to metaphysical truths about uncaused causes or unmoved movers, etc. Now, if that's a form of rational inquiry grounded in science, the move that says, well, all rational inquiry is science, we say, oh, then those are scientific arguments. Now, both Aquinas and Aristotle were using those as arguments to prove the existence of God, metaphysical arguments to prove the existence of God. But if you expand what counts as science to include metaphysics, then natural theology becomes part of science. Metaphysics becomes part of science. Well, of course, that's not what the scientists or scientism wanted in the first place. If we include as part of science the metaphysical assumptions on which it relies, the existence of God might be argued from the same very metaphysical assumptions which also underline science. Aristotle thought so. Aquinas thought so. Thus, according to this view, metaphysical arguments for the existence of God become part of science. Natural theology itself constitutes a kind of science. Now, of course, Aristotle and Aquinas would have had no problem with this, but that's because they didn't think there was a sharp divide between philosophy and what we refer to today as science. But the modern scientists, right, the Galileo and post-Galileo crowd, they want to say, no, there is a sharp divide between science and philosophy, between science and metaphysics. Well, if there's no divide, then scientism becomes trivial. If there is, in fact, a divide, then scientism becomes incoherent, right? And again, that's the dilemma that he's pointing out in his first argument against scientism. But the current divide between modern philosophy and modern science is the result of the rejection of metaphysical principles as part of science and the insistence that modern science must restrict itself to, quote, the narrow conception of science on which a discipline is only scientific to the extent that it approximates the mathematical modeling techniques and predictive methods of physics. There's a quote from Professor there, right? Phaser. And so notice, if that is what characterizes science, then it distinguishes modern science from philosophy, right? And I think there's plenty of scientists which would be happy with that. There's plenty of philosophers who would be happy with that. I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy with the idea that that exhausts the domain of rational inquiry. I think metaphysics is different than science, but I also think that metaphysics is a form of rational inquiry. So I'm not a scientistic individual. While it is true that the claims of metaphysics may not be expressible in mathematical languages and are not based on specific predictions or experiments, nevertheless, they are no more certain than the claims of physics, no less certain than the claims of physics, right? Because they're starting from the metaphysical presumptions of physics and moving on outward from there. Perhaps more certain, metaphysical demonstrations are not inductive generalizations. Metaphysical demonstrations very often are deductively sound or deductively valid arguments. Quoting from Phaser again, he says, "The point is that if the advocate of scientism defines science so broadly that anything for which we might have a rational philosophical argument counts as scientific, then he has no non-arbitrary reason for denying that a philosophically grounded theology, or indeed any other aspect of traditional metaphysics, could, in principle, count as science. But the whole point of scientism was supposed to be to demonstrate that metaphysics was not part of science. Indeed, to cast suspicion on metaphysics because it wasn't science." Quoting Phaser again, he says, "Hence, if the advocate of scientism can avoid making his doctrine self-defeating only by defining science this broadly, then the view becomes completely vacuous." The second problem that Phaser points to, the second main problem is that science cannot, in principle, provide us with a complete description of reality. Science is self-limiting to a purely quantitative description of the world, regarding mathematics as the language of the book of nature. The language of the book of nature. Galileo had famously put it that way, right? The book of nature is written in mathematics. Hence, it is hardly surprising that physics, more than other disciplines, has discovered those aspects of reality susceptible to prediction and control characteristics of quantifiable phenomena. Those are the only aspects to which the physicist will allow himself to pay any attention in the first place. Everything else necessarily falls through his methodological net. What is he talking about here? Well, the physicist quite deliberately limits himself or herself to looking at the quantifiable world, the world that can be understood through number, that can be quantified, right? That's a methodological restriction. Right? We might think of Locke and primary and secondary properties. Well, the physicist has sort of adopted the idea that I'm only going to pay attention to primary qualities, right? Shape and figure and density and mass and velocity, et cetera, right? Energy. But those things which can be quantified. Now, that's all they will look at, right? They're only looking at the world that can be quantified. They're looking at the quantifiable aspects of reality. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But then to go on beyond that and say, that's all we're looking at. And you know what? That's all there really is. That doesn't follow. Right? Just because for methodological reasons, we choose not to look at the qualitative and restrict ourselves to the quantitative, that in and of itself doesn't prove that the qualitative doesn't exist. It just says, yeah, but we're not talking about it. Fine, you don't need to talk about it while you're doing physics. But sometimes some people do need to talk about it. And when they do, it's not like they're doing something irrational or they're engaged in irrational inquiry. There's a sense in which they have found the easiest Easter eggs to find. Then they declare that theirs are the only Easter eggs that there are, and their way of looking is the only way to search. So notice they're saying, look, we're only going to look at the quantifiable. Right? And oh, look, we found all this quantifiable stuff. Then they go on to say, and that's all there is, the quantifiable. They go, well, why do you say that that's all there is? So, well, that's all we ever find. Yeah, but that's all you ever look for. Yes. So how do you know there isn't more? Because we never find anything more. Yeah, but you don't look for anything more. So when asked, how do you know that yours are the only Easter eggs there are? They respond, because those are the only ones that turn up when you search the proper way. And then when asked, how do you know that your way of searching is the only proper way to look? They say, well, because our way is the one that turns up all of the Easter eggs that there are. Yeah, but you're presuming, again, that the ones you find are the only ones there are. The success of physics, in part, is explained by the questions it chooses to address and by the questions it chooses to ignore. So it's ignoring the qualitative, it's ignoring certain aspects of reality that don't fit into its methodological field of investigation, and that's fine, so long as they realize we are selecting to focus only on the quantifiable. What Feser's argument with them here is the scientism person, right, the advocate of scientism, is going on to say, and all that physics turns up is all there is. It's all that exists. Now, that's where Feser says that the scientism errs. We perceive colors, sounds, flavors, odors, warmth and coolness, pains and itches, thoughts and choices, purposes and meanings. Physics abstracts from these rich, concrete details, ignores whatever cannot be expressed in terms of equations and the like, and thereby radically simplifies the natural order. There's nothing wrong with such an abstractive procedure as long as we keep in mind what we're doing and why we're doing it. So this is a quote from Feser, right? He's saying, look, there's nothing wrong with going from our rich experience of the world and reducing it to a much more simplified version, the quantitative. So long as we know what we're doing, right? We're ignoring a whole lot of reality and why we're doing it, because we're really interested in investigating this corner of the world, right? That's fine. The success of physics doesn't for a moment show that the natural world has no features other than those described in a physics textbook. The reason qualitative features don't show up is not because their method has allowed us to discover that there aren't any, but rather that the method has essentially stipulated they are to be left out of the description, whether they are there or not. So the methodology of physics says we don't include the qualitative. That doesn't show the qualitative doesn't exist. It's just not what we're talking about today, right, as physicists. Feser offers some variation of Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. And so notice he's saying the secondary qualities, warmth and color, but we might also say things like beauty and meaning, exist only in our perceptual awareness of matter rather than in matter itself as qualia. So rendered, scientism admits qualitative features of the world exist, but only as redefined by physics. But this only makes the qualitative features more rather than less problematic. So notice the advocate of scientism might say, well, yes, these qualitative features do exist, but they only exist as secondary properties, properties of perception, but they're not real physical properties that of the physical world. They're simply problems of our qualities of our mind. Remember, this is what Locke talks about. But what Feser is pointing out is that's only going to work so far, right? Because what are these qualia? What are these mental experiences if they're not physical? The contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel makes a similar claim, where he says the modern mind-body problem arose out of the scientific revolution of the 17th century as a direct result of the concept of objective physical reality that drove that revolution. Galileo and Descartes made the crucial conceptual division by proposing that physical science should provide a mathematically precise quantitative description of an external reality extended in space and time, a description limited to the spatiotemporal primary qualities such as shape, size, motion, and to laws governing the relations among them. So notice this is what the science of Galileo, the science of Descartes, and the science of the modern individuals offered, right? This is what science needs to concern itself with exclusively. The spatio-temporal world and the physical properties, we might say primary properties of that physical spatial temporal world. Subjective appearances, on the other hand, how the physical world appears to human positions, were assigned to the mind, and the secondary qualities like color, sound, and smell were to be analyzed relationally in terms of the powers of physical things acting on the senses to produce those appearances in the mind of observers. It was essentially to leave out or subtract subjective appearances and the human mind, as well as human intentions and purposes from the physical world, in order to permit this powerful and austere spatio-temporal conception of objective physical reality to develop. So again, while they're developing their scientific worldview, they're going, well, let's take the qualitative and we'll relegate it to secondary qualities or qualities of mind or perception. But physicists don't need to talk about that. Physicists just need to talk about the real physical stuff. But that means the mind itself cannot be treated as part of the material world. The brain, no less than any other bit of Cartesian matter, is devoid of qualitative features. But the mind, the mental, is replete with qualitative features. Indeed, mind is essentially defined by its possession of qualitative features. Cartesian dualism is not a resistance to mechanistic science, but a direct consequence of it. So notice, if I take the qualitative and I sort of relegate it to the mind, but nothing in the physical world is qualitative, well, then the mind is not part of the physical world. That's what the Cartesian dualism. And it's not like I'm being obstinate. You gave me no other choice because you've kind of banished or exercised all the qualitative in your quantitative description of reality. Edward Schrödinger, physicist, makes a similar claim when he says this: we are thus facing the following strange situation. While all the building stones for the modern scientific world picture are furnished by the senses, qua organs of mind, while the world picture itself is and remains for everyone a construct of his mind, and apart from it, it has no demonstrable existence, the mind itself remains a stranger in this picture. It has no place in it, and it can nowhere be found in it. So even though we acquire our understanding of reality through our sensual perception of the world, we become incapable of explaining our sensual perceptions of the world, our world of smell and taste and color and sound, etc., in the purely quantitative language of physics. This problem was anticipated actually by the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus, who imagines a supposed conversation between the intellect and this sort of quantitative reductionism and the senses, which is a sort of qualitative anti-reductionism. And it was quoted by Schrödinger in the book I referenced. Right? The intellect says this: color is by convention, sweet is by convention, bitter by convention. In truth, there are but atoms and the void. Sounds like a physicist, right? Or a scientism advocate. But then the retort by the senses: wretched intellect, from us you are taking the evidence by which you would overthrow us. Your victory is your own fall. In other words, you're using qualitative experience to gain your understanding of quantitative reality, And then you're saying there is nothing to qualitative experience. Well, again, it's an incoherence. Faeser concludes, Democritus's point and Schrodinger's is that it will not do to take an eliminative line and deny that the problematic qualitative features of reality exist at all. For it is only through observation and experiment, and thus through conscious experiences defined by these very qualitative features, that we have evidence for the truth of scientific theories, in the name of which we would be eliminating the qualitative. Such eliminative materialism is incoherent. So again, he's just summing up what Schrodinger and Democritus both had said. Right? Further, it would seem that this is not merely a temporary failing of the current science. Rather, it is not possible that further application of the mechanistic project will solve the problem of consciousness. Right? Thomas Nagel makes this point, Faeser makes this point as well. Stripping away the qualitative features of all phenomenon and redefining it in purely quantitative terms is the one method that cannot in principle work when seeking to explain conscious experience. So in other words, trying to do a materialistic reduction of conscious experience to mechanistic forces, that's the one thing that simply isn't going to work, according to Faeser. Actually, Nagel makes the same point. And why is this? For conscious experience, the method itself tells us just, the method itself just is the rug under which all the qualitative features have been swept. Applying the same method to the explanation of qualitative features of conscious experience is thus simply incoherent, and in practice either changes the subject or amounts to a disguised eliminativism. So if the problem arises from trying to redefine the qualitative in quantitative language, if that's the problem, then just trying to do more of it isn't going to solve the problem. It's just going to exacerbate the problem. So the mechanistic reduction simply isn't going to work. Now, again, let me be clear and not misrepresent Faeser, or for that matter, Nagel on this point. They're not saying that physics isn't entirely victorious on the grounds it stakes out and does a wonderful job doing what it intends to do. Their argument isn't with physics. Their argument isn't with empirical science. Their argument is with scientism, who wants to say the world as described by physics is the only way to describe the world. And the realities investigated by physics are the only realities that exist. That's where they say, no, you've overplayed your hand. And again, a purely quantitative description in principle cannot be an exhaustive description of reality. Why? It's not going to take care of the qualitative. Nagel pointed out this problem long ago, actually, in 1979. Schrodinger saw it in the 50s, but this is a quote, I believe it's from Nagel, where he says, scientific theories serve to facilitate and survey, scientific theories serve to facilitate the survey of our observations and experimental findings. Every scientist knows how difficult it is to remember a moderately extended group of facts before at least some primitive theoretical picture about them has been shaped. It is therefore small wonder, and by no means to be blamed on the authors of original papers or textbooks, that after a reasonably coherent theory has been formed, they do not describe the bare facts that they have found or wish to convey to the reader, but clothe them in the terminology of the theory or theories. This procedure, while very useful for our remembering the facts in a well-ordered pattern, tends to obliterate the distinction between the actual observations and the theories arising from them. And since the former always are of some sensual quality, theories are easily thought to account for the sensual qualities, which of course they never do. So he wants to say, look, our theories arise from qualitative experiences. Now, we eventually describe our theories in quantitative terms, And so we might lose sight of the fact that the origins of our theories are qualitative experiences, right? And that's not to be blamed, because it's a way of summarizing a great deal of data in abstract ways and covering a lot of information that way. But again, the last sentence, since the former always comes as some sensual quality, theories are easily thought to account for sensual qualities, which of course they never do, right? The theories are not going to be able to account for the sensual qualities themselves. The reason that, of course, they never do is that the scientist's working notion of matter is one that has, by definition, extruded the qualitative from it. So again, Descartes describes matter as res extensia, right? Extended stuff, unthinking extended stuff. Hence, when the scientist identifies some physical property or process he finds correlated with the qualitative features of conscious experience, this or that property of external objects, this or that process in the brain, and supposes that in so doing he has explained the qualitative, he is in the thrall of an illusion. He is mistaking the theoretical, quantitative redescription of matter he has replaced the qualitative with for the qualitative itself. So notice if I say, oh, what a pain really is a neuron firing in your brain. Well, I've replaced the qualitative pain with the quantitative brain activity. But that's not to say I've identified it, right? I may have correlated it, but I haven't shown that the two are identical. The scientist may accuse his critic of dualist obscurantism when the critic points out that all the scientist has identified are physical features that are correlated with qualitative features, rather than the qualitative itself. But such accusations merely blame the messenger, for it is the scientist's own method that has guaranteed that dualist correlation is all he will ever discover. So because all you're looking at is the quantitative, and then you're trying to redescribe the qualitative in quantitative terms, then all you're ever going to have is correlation. You're never going to be able to establish identity. That's the problem, right? Nagel sometimes had pointed this out as what he calls the hard problem of consciousness. He doesn't really see any way around that. So, while a Cartesian account of the relation between qualitative features of the world to quantifiable matter may be unacceptable, Descartes' dualism, we may not want to embrace Descartes' dualism, right? The fact remains that the qualitative features of the world cannot in principle be explained scientifically or coherently eliminated. So that's again a snapshot of Fesser's main argument here. You can't simply eliminate the qualitative because it's a feature of human life. Science and experience itself rely on it, but you can't explain it away in terms of the quantitative because all you'll ever get is correlation, not reduction. Bertrand Russell, yet another hero of contemporary naturalists who saw things more clearly than they did, indicates how, quote, it is not always realized how exceedingly abstract is the information that theoretical physics has to give. It lays down certain fundamental equations which enable it to deal with the logical structure of events, while leaving it completely unknown what is the intrinsic character of the events that have the structure. All that physics gives us is certain equations, given abstract properties of their changes. But as to what it is that changes and what it changes from and to, as to this, physics is silent. So what is the nature of reality, right? It might be describing certain features of reality, but it's leaving unanswered the question of, but what is it? Russell is suggesting that even if physics gives us the abstract structure of the material world, we might still ask whether or not physics can tell us anything about the intrinsic nature of that which has the structure. If not, then Number one, physics does not tell us everything about physical reality. So it isn't even an exhaustive account of the world it's limiting itself to. But physics does tell us that there must be something more to physical reality than what it has to say. So physics itself is pointing beyond itself to aspects of physical world which it cannot, in principle, investigate. Russell, Schrödinger, and most other modern commentators on these matters are still working with either with an entire post-Cartesian framework. Right? So they're not embracing the Cartesian ideas. Right? Russell, for instance, attempts to solve both the problems by identifying the qualitative features themselves as intrinsic properties of matter. So he's suggesting that the qualitative is real, but it's an intrinsic property of matter that Descartes simply was wrong to say was not part of material reality. Fazer himself does not accept this. He doesn't accept the Russellian account. He maintains that the scholastic approach is incommensurable with that framework. So again, Fazer is, again, the neo-scholastic, and he thinks the scholastic approach is preferable to the one recommended by Russell. But we don't have to worry about that, right? How do we fix the problem? In this lecture, I'm just trying to pose the problem. Regardless, the problems described are philosophical rather than scientific. Thus, science is nowhere close to giving us an exhaustive description of reality. And number two, the very nature of scientific method shows that there must exist aspects of reality, physical reality at that the scientific method itself will not capture. The third problem that Fazer points out with scientism is the explanatory limits of science. Just as there are limits to what science can describe, there are also limits to what science can explain. So it's not going to be exhaustive, right? Science is going to be able to explain some things, but it's not going to be exhaustively explanatory. And so those explanations have to be provided by some other form of rational inquiry if they're to be provided at all. So the third problem of scientism, he points to laws of nature, in terms of which science explains phenomena. But what he's pointing out, Fazer is that laws of nature cannot in principle provide an ultimate explanation of reality. And why is this? Preview and coming attractions. Because laws of nature are not self-explanatory. Right? It's only natural for us to ask, what makes a law of nature a law of nature? Where do laws of nature come from? What sustains laws of nature? And if those questions make sense, then laws of nature are not self-explanatory, and ultimate explanations that require use of laws of nature must have a deeper explanatory base, right? So I'm going to explain event A, B, and C by appealing to a law of nature. I'm not done then, because then you say, and what explains the law of nature? Oh, there's a more fundamental explanatory explanation necessary. Consider physicist Lawrence Krauss's book, The Universe from Nothing, a relatively recent book. Well, I guess it's not that recent now, it's almost 10 years old, but he writes this book, A Universe from Nothing. And we did not do natural theology in this course, but sometimes when I start looking at natural theology as the first module for our intro, we spend time looking at cosmological arguments and arguments which attempt to prove the existence of God by looking at the cosmos. And one of the most common cosmological arguments was basically saying, well, the universe had to be created and it couldn't have created itself, therefore it must have a creator. I'm not going to go into the details of that argument, but that's basically how it works. So the idea is that the universe didn't come from nothing. So Krauss is deliberately taking aim at cosmological arguments with his title of his book by basically saying, no, scientists can explain how the universe came from nothing. A universe from nothing, that's his book, right? So again, for the first bullet, the title suggests that he will give a complete explanation in purely scientific terms for the existence of the universe as a whole, or why anything exists at all. If you were really able to do that, if you were really able to use science to provide us with a reason for why there's any universe at all, and why it has the characters it has, then that really would be an exhaustive explanation of all of reality. But for the most part, his book only explores how the energy present in otherwise empty space, together with the laws of physics, might have given rise to the universe as it exists today. So actually, the way the book plays out is he isn't explaining the universe from nothing. He's saying, well, given a certain amount of energy in empty space and given laws of physics, here's how the universe might have developed. So after offering that, Krauss then acknowledges that energy, space, and laws of physics don't really count as nothing after all. He proposed that the laws of physics alone might do the trick, but these don't really count as nothing either. Krauss's final proposal is that there may be no fundamental theory at all, but just layer upon layer of laws of physics, which we can probe until we get bored. This is a quote from Krauss's book. But notice that seems to be a curious bait and switch, as I say, right? Because the title suggests that he's going to provide exactly what in the end he says we really can't, right? A fundamental account of why there's any universe at all. Now, maybe that question has no answer, but to suggest that science provides it is simply not true. Fazer points to the deeper problem. The deeper problem, according to Fazer, is that Krauss not only does not deliver on his promise, but that he could not have done so. For any appeal to the laws of nature, or even series or layers of laws of nature, simply raises questions about what a law of nature is in the first place, how it has any efficacy, and where it, or the series, layers, comes from. And these are questions which the scientific mode of explanation, which presupposes laws of nature, cannot in principle answer. So notice, if my way of investigating the world presupposes laws of nature, then my way of investigating the world is never going to be able to explain laws of nature because I'm going to be presupposing them, right? So that's the one thing science can't do. Fazer, a scholastic, offers the scholastic notion of what a law of nature is. For scholastics, a law of nature is, quote, shorthand way of describing the manner in which a thing or system will operate given its nature or essence. So we don't need to spend too much time on that. But if gold is an essential feature, right? It has an essence, it has a nature, then it will necessarily behave in certain ways and necessarily not behave in other ways. It has a certain set of pre-established potential ways it could be. There are also potential ways it could not be. And laws of nature are simply the regularities that we observe when we see gold acting in its characteristic essential ways. Right? So for the scholastic, laws of nature are not fundamental, essences are fundamental. Laws of nature are simply a consequence of things having essences and exhibiting essential or characteristic behaviors. This is the scholastic approach to understanding physical laws. But on this view, laws of nature presuppose the existence and operations of the physical things that follow inherent formal and final causes. And in that case, the laws cannot possibly explain the existence and operations of the material things themselves, because it's the other way around. It's the behavior of the material things that explain the laws of nature or the regularities that we witness. In particular, and contrary to writers like Krauss, since the ultimate laws of nature presuppose the existence of the physical universe and the objects that comprise it, the same laws cannot intelligibly be appealed to as a way of explaining the existence of the universe. We might, as modern science does, reject the scholastic appeals to formal and final causalities to give an alternative account of laws of nature. So I'm not suggesting at this point that the scholastics are correct about this. Maybe we shouldn't be appealing to formal and final causalities. An alternative view offered by the first generation to reject scholastic worldview, right? The generation of Descartes and Newton, for instance, was irreducibly theological and shorthand for the idea that God has set the world up so as to behave in certain regular ways to describe laws of nature. So when Newton was talking about laws of nature, he literally meant God's laws. So where do laws come from? God. That's where they come from, according to Newton. So he gives a theological explanation for these scientific laws. But number one, there's a lot of scientists who wouldn't be happy with that today. But number two, notice that's not a scientific claim. It's a theological claim, or perhaps a philosophical claim. So this account of law of nature has God's actions strictly and ultimately doing the explaining in science. In other words, the ultimate explanation, science is able to explain anything at all only because it ultimately rests, according to Newton, on the explanatory power of God. Again, there's a lot of modern scientists who would reject that, but that is one way around the scholastic answer, right? So you don't have to talk about essences or formal and final causalities, but you end up having to talk about God. A third view on laws of nature is that these are really nothing more than a description or summary of the regular patterns we happen to find in the natural world. To say that such and such is a law of nature is only to say that A has been followed by B repeatedly in the past. On this view, the law is simply saying that A's tend to follow B's in a regular way, and that is that. But this account of a law, this third one now that we're looking at, tells us only that such and such a regularity exists, but not why the regularity exists. On this account, the laws of nature don't explain the regularity, they merely redescribe the regularity in different jargon. So we say, the law of free fall is that objects fall to the earth at a rate of 32 feet per second in a vacuum, right? And that's the law of free fall. And you say, why is that? It always does that. Okay, but why does it always do that? It just does. It's a regularity. But why does that regularity exist? Well, notice, if I don't go beyond that, all I'm stating is it is an observed regularity that, in and of itself, that's just a redescription of the regularity. That's not an explanation of the regularity. Quoting from Phaser, needless to say, then this sort of view hardly supports the claim that science can provide an ultimate explanation of the world. So if I say, well, it's doing that because it's a law of nature, you say, and then why is that a law of nature? Well, just because it always does that, right? Well, then I really haven't given you an explanation. I've simply pointed to an observed regularity. A fourth view of the law of nature would be to interpret a law of nature as abstract objects, something comparable to Platonic forms, right? So that these laws of nature are somehow real mind-independent necessities. But as with an appeal to God, this account of law of nature doesn't really present them as ultimate explanations of anything, but rather relies ultimately on these metaphysical items to do the explaining, right? So if I say, laws of nature are explained by these extra-mental, mind-independent realities, these sort of Platonic abstractions, well, then they're the ones that are doing the explanation, not the observed regularities in the first place, right? We would still need to know how it comes to be that there is a physical world, how it participates in these laws, why it participates in these laws rather than some alternative set of laws, and so on. Regardless of what account one wishes to endorse, answering such questions is the business of philosophy, not science, because philosophy investigates precisely what all possible scientific explanations must take for granted. So that's really a quick summation of Fesser's third point here, right? That science cannot even in principle give us an exhaustive explanation of the world. Why? Because science relies on laws of nature as an explanatory resource, and science cannot explain where laws of nature come from while doing science. That in order to explain where the laws of nature come from, you've left the domain of science and you've entered the domain of metaphysics or philosophy of science. Some might suggest that the sort of ultimate explanations philosophy seeks here is simply not to be had, that we cannot ever determine what the answer to these questions are. Indeed, perhaps there are no such answers. So you might say, well, look, we can go as far as laws of nature, but we can't go any further. We can't give an account of where laws of nature come from or what they're. That is the limit, right? The limit, laws of nature is the limit of what we can explain or how we can explain. Whoops, I went the wrong way. There we go. Bertrand Russell, for instance, seems to suggest that this kind of a response, right? That there are certain brute facts about reality that we have to acknowledge, and these brute facts are themselves not explained by anything, that there is no explanation in the offing. But even to claim this, that there are brute facts, and maybe laws of nature are some of them, but even to claim that is to make a philosophical claim, not a scientific one. And so again, you're going to engage in the business of philosophy and philosophy of science, not science. Finally, we get to what Fraser claims is a bad argument for scientism. So some have suggested that the unparalleled predictive and technological successes of modern science account for the enduring allure of scientism. Consider the argument for scientism given by Alex Rosenberg, whom we've looked at before in this book, his book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And he writes, quote, "The technological success of physics is by itself enough to convince anyone with anxiety about scientism that if physics isn't finished, it certainly has the broad outlines of reality well understood." So the mere fact that physics has been so successful is good reason to think that it does have the broad outlines of reality set, and we still have more work to do in physics and to complete our understanding of reality, but we've got the borders down, right? We know where the edges are. And it is not just the correctness of the predictions and the reliability of technology that requires us to place our confidence in physics' description of reality. Because physics predictions are so accurate, the methods that produce the description must be equally reliable. Otherwise, our technological powers would be a miracle. Again, this is Rosenberg talking now, right? So he's saying, look, if it weren't the fact that science is providing us with accurate, correct, and perhaps exhaustive description and explanation of the world, then its usefulness would be miraculous. Why would it be so useful if it wasn't fundamentally correct? We have the best of reasons to believe that the methods of physics, combining controlled experiment and careful observation with mainly mathematical requirements on the shape theories can take, are the right ones for acquiring all knowledge. Carving out some area of inquiry or belief as exempt from exploration by the methods of physics is a special pleading is a case of special pleading or self-deception. Again, this is Rosenberg talking now, right? So what he's saying is, look, since physics has been so successful, we should simply apply the methods of physics for all investigation, and to say, oh no, there's an area that physics and that mode of investigation doesn't work for, according to Rosenberg, is simply a case of special pleading or self-deception. No, physics can give us an exhaustive account of all knowledge. Why do I say that? Because it's been so darn successful. All right, so this is the argument that Rosenberg is offering, and this is the argument that Fraser thinks is a terrible argument. Rosenberg concludes, the phenomenal accuracy of its prediction, the unimaginable power of its technological application, and the breathtaking extent and detail of its explanations are powerful reasons to believe that physics is the whole truth about reality. Of course, many proponents of scientism would regard Rosenberg's physics-only version as too restrictive. They would regard sciences like chemistry, biology, and the like as also genuine sources of knowledge, even if it turned out that they're irreducible to physics. So one ideal is that you could get biology talk to reduce to physics talk. I'm sorry, biology talk to reduce to physics. Try that one more time. biology to reduce to chemistry, chemistry reduces to physics, physics to particle physics, and then you have a single edifice of all scientific knowledge. But even if that's not really possible, even if we can't get, say, biology to reduce to physics, there are some who say, yeah, but the methods that we see in physics are also applied in biology. And so all of that would be rational inquiry and giving us genuine knowledge, the empirical sciences in general. They would agree with Rosenberg's main point that the success of science, broadly construed, supports scientism. Rosenberg's argument, suitably modified in a way that would make it acceptable for other defenders of scientism, is essentially this. The predictive power and technological applications of science, broadly conceived, are unparalleled by those of any other purported source of knowledge. Therefore, what science reveals to us is probably all that is real. Faeser claims. Now this, I maintain, is a bad argument. How bad is it? About as bad as this one. Metal detectors have had far greater success in finding coins and other metallic objects in more places than any other method has. Therefore, what metal detectors reveal to us, coins and other metallic objects, is probably all that is real. Maybe you see the parallel, maybe you don't. But what he's saying is, just because metal detectors are good at detecting metal objects, and they're better than alternative ways of trying to detect metal objects, or it doesn't show us that the deliverances of metal detectors is all there is to talk about, or all that exists. So just because the empirical sciences are better at giving us information about empirical reality than perhaps any other method of investigating that nature of reality, it doesn't necessarily follow that the deliverances of the empirical science, they're telling us about all that there is to talk about, or all that's real. It just doesn't follow. Faeser's point here is that metal detectors, as physics does, restricts the range of items it seeks to detect and gather information about. Metal detectors restricts itself to metal objects. Don't know why I keep doing that. And science restricts itself to the empirical world. In fact, the success of metal detectors requires this restricted range. But here we certainly do not think that this success means the domain of reality it investigates is exhaustive of all reality. So Faeser's point here is that metal detectors are constructed in such a way as to restrict what it's interested in investigating. And it's very good at doing what it was constructed to do. Similarly, physics was restricted to limit what it's set up to investigate. So no surprise, it's very good at giving results on what it was set up to do. But that's not to say that metal detectors do everything that's worth doing, or that physics does everything that's worth doing, or tells us about everything that's worth investigating. Likewise, physics methodology restricted from investigating anything other than those aspects of the natural world susceptible to mathematical modeling. But however successful it is in carrying out this project, it does not follow that their domain of reality is exhaustive of all reality, nor that it can answer all the reasonable questions which confront the reflective human being. Faeser notes that Rosenberg adds to his argument the suggestion that those who reject scientism do not do so consistently. Rosenberg writes, "Scientism is the pejorative label given to our positivist view by those who really want to have their theistic cake and dine at the table of science's bounty too. Opponents of scientism would never charge their cardiologists or auto mechanics or software engineers with scientism when their health, travel plans, web surfing are in danger. but just try subjecting their non-scientific mores and norms, their music or metaphysics, their literary theories or politics to scientific scrutiny, they immediately respond with the outrage of humane letters is scientism. Right? So when we start using science to investigate things like music or literary theories or politics, then they charge, oh, you're being scientistic, right? Quoting Fazer, he says, according to Rosenberg, unless you agree that science is the only genuine source of knowledge, you cannot consistently believe that it gives us any genuine knowledge. But this is about as plausible as saying that unless you think metal detectors alone can detect physical objects, then you cannot consistently believe that they detect any physical objects. Those beholden to scientism are bound to protest that the analogy is no good, on the grounds that metal detectors detect only part of reality, while science detects the whole of it. But such a reply would simply beg the question, for whether science really does describe the whole of reality is precisely at issue. So if you say, oh, I don't like your analogy because we know that metal detectors are only looking at one aspect of reality, but science isn't just looking at one aspect of reality, it's looking at all of reality. Fazer's response is, that's exactly my point. We have no reason to believe it is looking at all of reality. In fact, we have very good reason to believe it is not looking at all of reality and can't look at all of reality. And that's not bad. I don't buy a metal detector in order to find clay or in order to find wood or in order to find water. And I don't do physics in order to do metaphysics or politics, right? But that's also, I buy metal detectors to detect metal. We do physics to understand the physical world. That's perfectly fine. That's not what scientism is claiming, though. Scientism was saying that physics, and more broadly, the empirical sciences, is exhaustive of all rational inquiry of reality. That's simply not justified. Fazer points out that Rosenberg's non sequitur, while very common, is a non sequitur nonetheless. That physics is successful at what it does, it doesn't follow from that all that physics does is all that's worth doing. Some defenders of scientism challenge its critics to match the predictive successes of science with a demonstrated predictive success and technological applications of metaphysics or theology. You say, well, if you think that metaphysics is a worthwhile rational discipline, or theology is a worthwhile rational discipline, can you show us the technological applications of those theories? Can you show us the predictive success, how you can use metaphysics to predict future occurrences and that sort of stuff? When no such comparable results can be provided, they suppose that this is sufficient to defeat the critics. Aha, you see, science is doing useful stuff, metaphysics and theology are not. Oops. But of course, this misses the point. Metaphysics is not science, precisely because it deals with those aspects of reality that are not subject to quantification and predictability. Quote, this is about as impressive as demanding a list of metal detecting successes from gardening or cooking or painting, and then concluding from the fact that no such list is forthcoming, that spades and spatulas and paintbrushes are all useless and ought to be discarded and replaced with metal detectors. So just because metaphysics and theology does not give us the same results that science gives us, doesn't mean it's not giving us anything useful. Right? They're not set up to be science. That's kind of their point. As Fazer points out, that a method is useful, perhaps outstandingly useful for certain purposes, does not entail that there are no other purposes worth pursuing, nor other methods more suitable for those other purposes. But even if the defender concedes that there are questions and methods for answering these questions outside of science, and thus acknowledge the role of philosophy attempts to play in human affairs. Nevertheless, they may insist that these speculative exercises are of comparatively little value, since they do not provide the definitive answers that science does, where consensus is achieved or something approaching consensus, nor do they generate the technologies and practical applications that science provides us with. So you might get a sort of modified scientism where you're saying, all right, look, there might be other things that forms of rational inquiry you can spend your time doing, right? Trying to hypothesize how many angels can dance on the head of the pin, but really isn't that a waste of time? And wouldn't your mental resources be better employed by engaging in science, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson has this sort of argument against philosophy, where he really thinks that it's a waste of intellectual capital, because even if there's some point to it, that intellect would be better spent in the pursuit of practical technological investigations and science. So this modified defense of scientism rests on the claim that science has superior practical value. But this doesn't really work either. It is simply silly to criticize philosophy for not being as good at achieving scientific aims as science is, since it isn't trying to achieve those ends. To achieve similar results, it too would have to restrict its domain of questions and methodologies, essentially becoming science. And therefore, it's not going to be seeking its own ends. It's going to be seeking the ends of science. But the whole point is that reflective human inquiry requires more than what science can provide. Phaser, quote, "For if you allow to count as scientific only what is predictable and controllable, and thus susceptible to consensus answers and technological applications, then naturally, but trivially, science is going to be one long success story. But this is no more shows that the questions that fall through science's methodological net are not worthy of attention than the fact that you've only taken courses you knew you would excel in shows that the other classes were not worth taking." So just because those aren't questions that science seeks to answer doesn't necessarily show in and of itself that those aren't questions worth taking up. And of course, the very claim that only scientific questions are worth investigating is not itself a scientific claim, but rather it's a philosophical one. So notice, if I'm going to defend the claim that scientific claims are the only ones worth investigating, I'm going to end up doing philosophy. And again, undercutting my own argument. Finally, defenders of scientism might fault philosophy and metaphysics for its reliance on intuition when performing conceptual analysis. The advocate of scientism will insist that unless metaphysics is naturalized, and by that they mean turned into science, by making it nothing more than science's bookkeeping department, then the only thing left for it to be is a kind of conceptual analysis. And the trouble with this is that we are told that we have no guarantee that our intuitions or our folk notions the conceptual analyst appeals to really track reality. And indeed, good reason to think that they do not, insofar as science often presents us with descriptions of reality radically different from what common sense supposes it to be like. So if you say, well, the kind of conceptual analysis that might go on in a philosophical discussion of a scientific project or scientific concept, et cetera, well, those kind of folk notions might completely be wrong. And so the conceptual analysis would be very dubious, or at least of dubious value. That's the criticism. Phaser responds, but this presumes that if science's methodological exclusion of certain common sense features of our experience of reality demonstrates these features are not, in fact, part of the natural world. In other words, if science is not describing the world in teleological terms, and you say, oh, we talk about purposes and things having purposes, but when we look at things scientifically, we see no evidence of things having purposes, and therefore our intuition, our common folk notion of teleology is mistaken. But that's only to assume that because this concept is not utilized by science, that in and of itself demonstrates it's a faulty or mistaken concept. But that's fallacious, right? You're presuming that because it conflicts with science, or at least it's not utilized by science, it's therefore unnecessary or mistaken. You can't just assume it, you would have to argue it. Claims about what science has shown vis-a-vis this or that metaphysical question invariably merely presuppose rather than demonstrate the certain metaphysical interpretation of science, right? So if I say, well, science doesn't use teleology, therefore teleology is not a metaphysical structure of the world, no, that doesn't follow. That's presupposing a metaphysical interpretation of the results of science. It's not arguing for it. The absence of a certain feature in the scientist's description of reality, such as teleology, gives us reason to doubt the feature's existence only given further argument, which must be a metaphysical rather than a scientific in nature. So then, to review where we've been, we've looked at 4 problems that Fazer is pointing out with scientism. First, that scientism either ends up being immediately self-defeating, or it avoids being self-defeating by becoming trivial and uninteresting. Second, that given its methodological limitations, it cannot even in principle give us a complete description of reality. It's not going to be able to deal satisfactorily with the qualitative, since it limits itself to the quantitative. In a similar fashion, he argues that it cannot in principle give us a fundamental explanation of reality, since its explanatory resources employ things like laws of nature. It presupposes laws of nature, therefore it doesn't explain laws of nature. So it's always going to be wanting deeper, more fundamental level of explanation, one that science itself cannot provide. And finally, his 4th claim is that the main argument offered in favor of scientism, namely the success of the empirical sciences in giving us predictive technologies, predictions and technologies, is itself not a very powerful, it's no argument whatsoever. It doesn't really demonstrate the truth of scientism. So it's been a little bit of a challenging romp through this critique of scientism, but hopefully you found it interesting. And that concludes my lecture for today. Thank you for your attention.